It's crazy how our cars and trucks are getting so smart these days.
Yeah.
They're practically smartphones on wheels now, right? Like you've got your GPS, Bluetooth.
Neat. And some even have self-driving features. It's pretty amazing when you think about it, Maishu. But all that connectivity, all those features, they kind of raise some serious questions.
About cybersecurity.
And that's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive today. We're looking at this recent article from Trucking Dive, MISA, and it really dives into how the U.S. government is making moves to, restrict certain technologies and vehicles. They're saying it's all about national security, MISA whole, but, and here's where it gets interesting, the trucking industry is exempt, for now at least. And as you can imagine, people definitely have some thoughts, some strong opinions about it. So the article's main point is this: the U.S. government's banning certain connected vehicle technologies in passenger vehicles, specifically linked to China and Russia. They're citing, of course, national security risks. But as I mentioned, this ban right now doesn't include the trucking industry. So that begs the question, why the special treatment for trucking?
Well, that's one of the things we're going to dig into today.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, isn't it? Because when we hear the term connected vehicle technologies, it sounds like something out of, I don't know, a sci-fi movie or something. But really, we're talking about things you and I probably use every day, like GPS navigation, Bluetooth for hands-free calling, Bluetooth, those Wi-Fi hotspots in some cars, and then, of course, the systems that make self-driving vehicles possible. And all of these can be vulnerable to security risks.
Okay, so let's talk about these national security risks everyone seems to be worried about. Are we talking about, like, someone hacking into your car and just blasting really annoying music? Or is it more serious than that?
Well, that could happen, I guess, but yeah, it's a lot more serious than that. Think about it this way. Imagine hackers getting access to your car's GPS data so they can track your movements or, and this is even scarier, or remotely control your vehicle. Now imagine that happening not just to you, but thousands or millions of vehicles. It could really mess things up. I mean, you could disrupt entire transportation networks, enter unlocal, mess with critical infrastructure, even use it for espionage.
Wow. Yeah, okay. That is definitely some scary stuff. So this ban on certain technologies, how's that supposed to work exactly?
Well, the article says the government's taking like a two-pronged approach. First, they're going to put some software restrictions in place, and those start with 2027 model year passenger vehicles. It's kind of like when you update your phone's operating system to fix those security holes. Then, in 2030, they're going after the hardware. That means they'll totally ban certain components, things like chips and sensors made by specific companies, the ones they've flagged.
Got it. So software first, then hardware? Makes sense. But hold on a second. We're talking about cars here, right? Why is this Trucking Dive article making this such a big deal?
That's the big question, isn't it? Because right now, the trucking industry, they're exempt from these restrictions. But the thing is, the fact that the government is taking such, drastic measures for passenger vehicles, it's a sign. Like, is this the beginning of a change in how they think about trucking? Could similar restrictions end up applying to trucks down the road?
Yeah, it definitely makes you wonder. So the article quotes the National Economic Advisor, who says that all of this, the bans, the restrictions, it's about protecting consumers and securing the American auto industry. Sounds reasonable, right? But is it really that straightforward? I mean, come on, there has to be more to this whole thing.
Yeah, I think it's good to be a little skeptical. This move, it's not happening out of nowhere. It's all part of this bigger trend, a geopolitical trend. Basically, countries are more and more hesitant to rely on, well, let's call them potentially adversarial nations, like China and Russia, for really important technologies. They're worried that these countries could use their tech knowledge for, for spying or to gain some kind of political leverage.
So it's almost like a tech arms race. You've got national security all tangled up with economic interests.
Exactly. It's messy, right? And that's where it gets even more complicated because not everyone is happy about this ban. The article mentions the owner-operator Independent Drivers Association, OOIDA. They're really pushing back against what the government's doing.
Yeah, their president, Todd Spencer, he straight up calls the security risks of using Chinese and Russian tech in trucks grave. What exactly does he mean by that?
Well, you got to remember, OOIDA, they represent independent truckers. So their concerns are coming from a couple of different angles. They're definitely worried about cybersecurity, but they're also thinking about their wallets, the economic impact of all this. Think about it. The technology that makes autonomous trucks possible relies heavily on the very tech the government wants to restrict. So If they can't use that technology, it could really slow down the development
Right.
of autonomous trucks. And OIDEA sees those autonomous trucks as a threat to their members' jobs. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They're worried about both security and
Yeah.
their livelihoods, which makes total sense. But the article also talks about another group, AVIA, who aren't thrilled about this ban either. But they seem to be coming at it from a whole other angle.
That's right. The Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association, AVIA, they say they're all for cybersecurity measures, but they're worried that these restrictions could stifle innovation in the autonomous vehicle sector if there aren't good alternatives. To the foreign-made components that are getting banned, then it could slow down the development and the rollout of self-driving technology.
They make a valid point. I mean, nobody wants to fall behind in this
Yeah.
in this whole tech race, right? but but if those components really are a security risk, what other options are there?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do you balance national security with, the need to keep pushing technology forward and stay competitive economically? It's not an easy answer. And to make it even more complicated,
And here's where I think things get really interesting. AVIA also brought up this concern about the data that companies have to give to the government for these security checks. They're worried that competitors could get their hands on that data, which, creates a whole other set of issues.
yeah, that's a really valid concern. It brings up questions about intellectual property protection and fair competition, especially within the autonomous vehicle industry. I mean, how much? Transparency is actually needed for security. And how do we prevent things from backfiring? Like, how do we make sure one company doesn't end up with an unfair advantage? Because of this, it's a tough balancing act.
So we're looking at this clash, right, between national security, economic concerns, and then you've got technological innovation.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a three-way tug of war. Everyone's trying to figure out how to hold on to their piece of the rope.
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated landscape, that's for sure. And the stakes are high. It's not just about governments and these big corporations. Ultimately, this is going to affect everyone from, individual truck drivers to consumers, people like you and me.
Right. Okay, so let's focus on the truckers for a minute. You mentioned earlier that OID's worried about their members' jobs. But how would these restrictions actually play out in their everyday lives? What would it actually look like for them?
Think about what truckers do. They rely so heavily on these connected technologies, to do their jobs efficiently and to stay safe. They use GPS navigation to plan their routes, make sure they stay on schedule, and also just not get lost, especially when they're driving through unfamiliar areas. And then there are the communication systems, right? To stay in touch with, dispatchers, their families, and don't forget about those safety features like lane departure warnings and automatic emergency braking. I mean, those things can literally save lives when you're out there on the road.
So if those technologies are restricted, or if maybe they even become too expensive, because of all these new regulations, it could really impact their ability to do their jobs effectively and maybe even put them at risk.
Exactly. And remember, we're not just talking about the possibility of them losing their jobs to automation sometime in the future. This is about the immediate impact on their day-to-day operations, their ability to earn a living.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture stuff.
Yeah.
But sometimes we forget about the actual people, the individuals whose lives are going to be most affected by these decisions.
Absolutely. And it's not just the truckers themselves. Consumers, everyone who buys things, we're all part of this too. Because if these restrictions lead to trucking companies having to pay more, guess what? Those costs are probably going to get passed down to us. We're going to see higher prices for everything, for groceries, electronics, you name it.
So it's like this ripple effect, right? It starts with these little tech components,
Yeah.
then it moves to the trucking industry, and eventually it hits all of us in our wallets. It's all connected.
It is. It really is. And we can't forget about data privacy either. Remember what AVIA was saying about companies having to hand over all this sensitive data to the government. Well, that data could include information about consumers, about us, where we shop, what we buy, even our driving habits.
It's interesting because the National Economic Advisor was talking about protecting consumers. But some people might argue that these restrictions could actually put consumer data at risk.
That's a really valid point. It shows how even policies that are meant to do good can have unintended consequences, something to think about.
And it's not just about unintended consequences here in the U.S. either, right? This involves global supply chains, international relations. This issue is much bigger than just one country.
Oh, absolutely. The world is so interconnected. What happens in one country can set off a chain reaction. If the U.S. restricts certain technologies, it might make other countries decide to create their own alternatives, which could lead to, I don't know, a more fragmented tech world, more competition.
Like a high-stakes chess game, isn't it?
Right.
Every move has the potential to change the whole board, and it's not always clear who's going to come out on top.
That's a great analogy, and it just shows how important it is to stay informed about these issues and to be a part of the conversation. Because the decisions we make now about this technology, they're going to affect the future of transportation, technology, and maybe even national security for a long time to come.
So what can our listener do to stay ahead of the curve on all of this? It seems like things are changing so fast.
Yeah, I know. It can be hard to keep up. But here's the thing. Don't just rely on headlines. Dig a little deeper. Explore different points of view. And form your own opinion, your own informed opinion about all this.
Don't just take everything you hear at face value, right? Do your own research and try to really wrap your head around this because it's complicated.
Exactly. There's so much information out there. Check out industry publications like Trucking Dive, government websites, even think tanks. There are a lot of organizations that focus on cybersecurity and transportation. And don't be afraid to ask questions,
Yeah.
Challenge what you hear, think about the long-term consequences, and talk to people who might have different opinions than you.
I like that. Engage in constructive dialogue. It's so easy to just, stick with people who agree with you, but it's important to hear from people who see things differently, even if you don't always see eye to eye.
I totally agree. That's how we learn and grow, and hopefully it'll help us find solutions that work for everyone. And don't forget, this is all still developing. What we know today could change tomorrow. So stay curious, stay informed, stay engaged.
Great advice. And speaking of staying informed, there's one more piece of this puzzle I think we need to talk about. We've covered the government's role, how the industry is reacting, and how all of this could impact consumers, the global landscape, anything. What about the human element here? What about the truckers themselves? We've covered a lot in this deep dive. I mean, we talked about the government's restrictions on this connected vehicle technology, the trucking industry's reactions, I should say, to SAF, because it seems like everyone's got a different take on this, and then the potential impact on consumers and the global tech landscape. It's a lot, but I keep coming back to this one question. What about the truckers themselves? I mean, how will all of this actually affect the people who are out behind the wheel?
Yeah, I think it's so easy to forget about the human side of this when we're talking about big policy decisions and, national security. But truck drivers, they're already dealing with a lot. Long hours, tough schedules, more and more regulations, and now they've got to figure out this whole world of cybersecurity and all these technological advances.
And like they're stuck in the middle of all this, right? Pressure from all sides, keep the supply chain moving, adapt to new technology, and now worry about national security. That's a lot.
It is. It really is. And I think it's important to try to see things from their perspective, to understand what they're going through. Because for a lot of truckers, these connected technologies, they're not just, fancy gadgets. They're essential tools that they need to do their jobs well, to stay safe.
Right. Earlier, we were talking about OOEA and their concerns about job security by Hector. But I'm thinking about the day-to-day impact as well. You mentioned GPS navigation, communication systems, all the safety features. Can you talk a bit more about how those technologies are actually integrated into like a trucker's everyday life?
Sure. So imagine you're a long-haul trucker, right? You're driving across the country. You're relying on your GPS, not just to find the best route, but to stay on schedule, make those deliveries on time,
Right.
and just not get lost, especially if you're driving through some place you've never been before. And then you've got your communication systems. Those are crucial for staying in touch with dispatchers, getting updates on traffic, weather, any changes to your route, and of course, staying in touch with family.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. Being away from family for so long, those communication systems must be a lifeline for a lot of truckers.
Absolutely. It helps them stay connected to their loved ones, to feel a little bit more normal when they're out there on the road for weeks at a time. And then, of course, you've got all the safety features, which are becoming more and more common in trucks now. Things like lane departure warnings, automatic emergency braking, the blind spot detection. I mean, these things can be lifesavers, especially when you're driving for hours and hours and fatigue starts to set in.
So if these technologies are restricted, or maybe even become so expensive that truckers can't afford them, could that actually make the roads less safe? Not just for the truckers, but for everyone else too.
That's a real concern, yeah. And it goes beyond safety too. If truckers are forced to use older technology, it could affect how much they can get done, how quickly they can make deliveries. And And that could lead to higher costs for everyone.
It seems like we've got a real disconnect here. The people making these policies, they're focused on national security, protecting the auto industry.
Yeah.
And then you've got the truckers who are just trying to do their jobs, do them safely, make a living, support their families.
It just goes to show how, even when you're trying to do the right thing, policies can have unintended consequences, especially if you're not really thinking about how those decisions are going to affect everyone involved.
So what's the takeaway for our listener then? If you're a trucker and you're feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this, or maybe even a little helpless, what can you do?
Don't be afraid to speak up. Make your voice heard. Get involved with organizations like OIWA, the ones who are fighting for truckers' rights. Talk to your elected officials. Let them know what you're thinking, what your concerns are. The more the people making these decisions understand how it's actually going to play out, in the real world, the better chance we have of finding solutions that work for everyone.
And what about those of us who aren't truckers? What can we do?
Well, even if you don't drive a truck, this still affects you. Think about it. Everything you buy, UA, the food you eat, your clothes, it all gets to you through this big, complex supply chain, ELIA. And trucking is a huge part of that. So it's important to understand what the industry is going through, what challenges they're facing, support policies that focus on security, A&D innovation, and be mindful of how those policies might impact the people who are literally keeping our economy going.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap of what we talked about today. Connected vehicle technology. It's under a lot of scrutiny right now. The trucking industry's got a free pass for the moment. Wow. But that could change, and it's a complicated issue. No easy answers we're talking about. National security, economic interest, technological advancement. It's a balancing act.
And we can't forget about the human element. We have to think about how all of this is going to affect truck drivers, consumers, everyone really. It's not just about numbers and policies. It's about people's lives.
We've covered a lot of ground today. I hope you're walking away with a better understanding of just how complex this whole issue is. If you're a trucker listening, remember, Vivek, you're not alone. There are people fighting